The word sanctions has become a common part of the global political discourse ever since Russia invaded Ukraine in February of this year. More recently in Pakistan, we've been hearing this term a lot with regards to the potential for trade between Pakistan and Iran, and especially with regards to potential oil import deals between Pakistan and Russia. My name is Mubashar, and I'm joined today by Noor Fatima, and today we are trying to understand the global sanctions regime. So, Noor, before we begin, why don't you give our audience a brief overview of what sanctions are and why are they imposed?
Thank you for the introduction, Mubashir. Sanctions, this is a very recent development in global politics, and we see that the sanctions regimes that are placed by countries and international organizations, that they're gaining currency over the years. So I feel like this is a very pertinent topic to discuss as well. Sanctions are essentially defined as non-armed coercive measures that are imposed to achieve certain goals. So the key terms here are non-armed, which means that there's no war going on, there's no invasion. When you impose a sanction, you're not issuing a declaration of war essentially. Although this carries its own caveats because countries interpret this term differently, but essentially countries are trying to control and regulate the behavior of other countries by primarily imposing economic measures, and that could be certain restrictions when it comes to trade. That could be blanket bans. That could be some countries saying that they will completely and entirely isolate a country, or they could be aiming at certain targeted sectors that are at the center of illicit activities, and so on and so forth. And sanctions are basically imposed to achieve either narrow policy objectives or broader policy objectives. So, this is something that's the reason why it's confusing and it's a bit of a conundrum to understand is we have every kind of sanction there is. And I personally feel it's better to understand it from a structural perspective. So, how widely is it applied? And then from there, go on to how narrow it can also be applied and see how that impacts countries and individuals and also just shapes the global order as a
Right.
result. So I hope that was helpful. It's a quite a nebulous term, though.
No, and I think you've introduced as well. But I was just wondering, have sanctions always been part of, part of the foreign policy toolkit, if you want to call it, for the powers, or is it a more recent development with regard, like, and when I say recent, I mean in terms of,
In the past 100 years or
yeah, in
so.
the past 100 years.
So it's a bit of both. We see some form of sanctions being imposed way back in the past, in the 16th and 17th century.
Really?
But yeah, but those were always accompanied by military
Right.
activities happening on ground. So sanctions by themselves were not really considered. There were some blockades going on. There were other economic measures that were being taken against countries to control their behavior. But they were usually either for territorial gain or they accompanied some kind of a military campaign.
Right.
In the past 100 years, and of course, it's pertinent to mention the signing of the UN Charter as well.
Because when that essentially outlawed the use of force, like
Exactly.
except in exceptional circumstances, but
Precisely. So that's where sanctions are also, they kind of gain their legitimacy. It's mentioned under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter as well, that states will be, when there's a threat to international peace and security, there are opportunities where states can impose non-armed coercive measures, and that includes the use of economic sanctions as well. And we see that ever since that came into being, there has been more of a leaning towards choking a country economically by imposing sanctions. And that has the even the application of that has changed a lot, especially in the past, I would say 30 years or so, from 1990 onwards. We have concrete examples following following the Cold War, I would say. That's the best time to study such regimes because they are supposedly a little bit free from the political impetuses of the Cold War.
Right.
So from 1990 onwards, we have concrete examples of sanctions regime and their impact and their implications when they're broadly applied, what effects they have on the sanctioned state, on the civilians within the sanctioned state. Are they efficacious enough? Do they achieve their policy objectives? And from there, we have the 9/11 attacks, the September 11 attacks, where the sanctions regime again evolved very quickly to meet the new challenges of that age. And from there, we have what we have now, which the Russia-Ukraine is a great example to study. The Iranian sanctions are also a great example of the multifocal ways of imposing sanctions. So there has been a bit of an evolution. I would say from 1990 onwards would be the best time frame to study sanctions.
And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the post-Cold War era in this. And, there's always this question of the efficacy of sanctions as a
Yes.
tool of foreign policy. And a lot of researchers have worked in great detail on this. There was one study back in the 90s. It's commonly known as the HSE study,
Yeah.
named after the three authors. And they basically found out that in their analysis, they said that, we looked at 115 cases of sanctions, and out of those, there were 40 cases in which sanctions were effective, which is like pretty effective when you look at in terms of foreign policy. But then this was followed up by so Robert Pape did a follow-up study to this, and once he adjusted the metrics, he was like, no, in reality, only 5 of those 115 cases were cases of effective sanctions. He also added, and based on what you said earlier, like without the threat of use of force, because in the previous study, the HSE study, 18 out of the 40 cases in which they said were successful involved the use of force. So that really brings the question, like how effective are they? And it's interesting that you say the post-Cold War era, because when we look at the global order between 1945 and the fall of the Soviet Union, and if we look at the world order now with the rise of China and the resurgence of Russia, the one thing that the current order gives countries is an alternate pathway, right? So between so the post 1990, the post Cold War era, the US was the global superpower. So you couldn't really have them be on their wrong side. There was no China to rescue you. There was no Russia to rescue you. Before that, countries could align themselves with the Soviet Union. Now, countries can align themselves with China or with Russia. You mentioned the current Ukrainian crisis, and yes, the West is trying to sanction Russia. But then I think a few days back we saw Russian, Chinese, and Iranian leadership. They were meeting together, and even then, when I look at the case of Iran, which I remember when in the final years of the Trump presidency, they said we are going to impose the most stringent sanctions on Iran ever. But then they, because of geopolitics, they end up giving India a waiver to carry on oil trade with Iran. China, I think, still gets, if I'm not wrong,
and the freedom to use the Bandar Abbas port in Iran.
Right. So, like in a way, the countries that are supposed to underpin the global order, they are themselves undermining it by.
That's true.
And they say that, we'll strangle, or to use your word, like economically choke the country. But there is another argument that sanctions actually force the country to be self-sufficient. And
very much so.
We've seen sanctions on Cuba, we've seen sanctions on North Korea, we've seen sanctions on Iran, and in some ways they're doing better than like in terms of like their growth and research and development in their own countries and countries which are not facing a lot of sanctions. Perhaps we can even add Pakistan to that list.
That's a very interesting thing you've mentioned, and I'm glad you've brought it up because we're also the discourse that we consume through our news media outlets and even our academia. I feel like there's a lot of justification of the Western sanctions regimes, and the studies that you've mentioned are highly relevant because what governments eventually end up doing at times is they change the goalposts in order to prove that their sanctions regime or whatever actions that they have taken were successful, and that's very common. That's a very common practice, and that's what governments do. They have their own narratives backing that up, and again, that really delves into the politics part of the debate. Well, what you've mentioned here about the efficacy of sanctions, I really feel like this kind of ties into how sanctions are applied. So there is a proper understanding of sanctions design. So in the past, and by past I mean the recent past, so say from the early 1990s, we saw sanctions regimes that comprised comprehensive sanctioning. So they would take one country, for example, Iraq, and they would apply every manner of sanctions on Iraqi citizens, on Iraqi industries, on Iraqi politicians, everybody from the government to the civilian and the country itself, in a bid to isolate that country. And what we saw from that was an intense humanitarian crisis where close to 500,000 children they died because they were deprived of critical medicines and vaccines.
I think even in the COVID pandemic, this case was like highlighted. Oh, what were countries that are facing sanctions? How do they access things like the COVID-19 vaccines? So that's a very relevant point. The humanitarian impact of all these sanctions.
So and I think it carried a lot of weight for the politicians. The fact that 500,000 children were dead. And I remember seeing an interview where Madeleine Albright was sort of, she was conflicted about this, but then she had to fall back and justify that the imposition of sanctions was justified and that was just a price to pay. But that kind of really illuminated the dark side of having such comprehensive sanctions, because belligerent Iraq remained belligerent Iraq. And it didn't dissuade the Saddam Hussein regime from what it was trying to do at that point. So the question was, when so many civilians are dead and you're imposing sanctions, you are creating a narrative within the country of us versus the world. And that's only going to fuel the belligerency rather than contain it. So what came out from there was this understanding in the West, particularly, that blanket sanctioning will not work. Rather, it is more pertinent to sanction either key sectors of the economy. So, for example, if you are an oil exporting state, the oil sector, in order to choke your ability to buy arms so that a war can continue. They're using the exact same terminology and the exact same rationale for the Russia sanctions now as well. They feel that if Russian energy exports can be outlawed, then which is, I see you smiling.
It's ironic because like
so
since the war broke out, all the European countries and even countries like India, who did not depend so much on Russian oil, but it was available on the cheap. They're filling their reserves with cheap Russian oil. And even if now they do bring in the sanctions, it's kind of hypocritical. For like 5-6 months you've been utilizing like back then there was no talk of sanctions. You were sanctioning individuals, yes, their industries maybe, yes, but because you depend on that energy. So it wasn't really a principled stance. But now when you realize, okay, fine, I think we'll be able to manage, so let's just sanction Russia.
But even with the European Union, for example, the dependency on Russian energy exports is so deep that they are not able to move away from them immediately. So they are saying that it'll take us 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line to completely become non-dependent on Russian energy. And that kind of shows you also, like, going back to the political debate, that, when you rely on neoliberalism so much, and when you have really integrated your economies and you have really relied on trade relations for so long, it's not that easy to break away from them, and it's not that easy on your own people. We see inflation, we see global inflation in countries that might have never had such high inflation ever before. Record-breaking levels of inflation and key energy prices going up, all because of a sanctions regime that may or may not be working, especially, as you say, when Russia is saying, oh, we had the highest number of energy exports now. So that again, we going back to the efficacy question, is it helpful at all? One thing I would like to mention is this was all on the sectors, right? So when we move away from the sectors, September 11 attacks kind of paved way for another kind of sanctioning, which is horizontal sanctions or thematic sanctions. So sanctions regimes that only focus on certain themes. For example, wherever there's the threat of terrorism, we will have counterterrorism sanctions. We will have sanctions with regards to proliferation financing. The European Union, in particular, is really taking the lead in this front because they do not come up with, for most part, they will name their sanctions as something that is tied to a theme, something that is tied to an idea or a rationale rather than a country or a people, in order to avoid their own sanctions regime being challenged in European courts. I feel like that's a very important thing because now the EU can come after you and say we can impose sanctions on you because you are not compliant with your human rights obligations.
Yeah.
Or something pertaining to cybersecurity and data rights protection. They're taking a lot of ownership and they're making a lot of strides on that. So the horizontalization of sanctions is also important to study, especially for countries like Pakistan, because now you can't come up with an us versus them narrative. Now there are metrics against which you may or may not have failed, and you're being targeted on certain themes. I would also like to plug in the entire FATF situation that we as a country have recently gone through. Pakistan was not being targeted because of Pakistan itself. It was targeted because within a very, very specific field, a subfield of which was AML CFT obligations, anti money laundering, countering financing of terrorism obligations. We were found to be not compliant with FATF standards initially, and that's what brought us in the crosshairs. And then we had to really do some targeted work in order to improve our compliance. And that's another story, of course. But the idea is that so you can't just be sanctioned because you're a country and your country's behavior is out of line. You can also be sanctioned because your country is failing on certain metrics that other countries are trying to, create a regime about. So that's important to note as well.
I think it's important with regards to what you said about the September 11 attacks. I think in and more so in this resurgent multipolar world, if I may call it that, because now I think you need to have done something so reprehensible that no one can avoid sanctioning you. When the 9/11 attacks took place, I think it was one of the brief moments in the current world order where everyone was unanimous in sanctioning the Taliban
Absolutely.
or whoever was behind it, like wherever the attacks originated from. But then that also brings another issue. Who decides whether someone's committed a crime or not? So for example, you have these lists of globally designated terrorists. There was recently a case where Pakistan had nominated an Indian national who should, according to the Pakistani government, be on that list, but the US turned that down. So again, what we see, I'm not saying whether that person should or should not be on that list, but there is a political angle to that as well. And then I think that ties in with what you call this new thematic way of sanctioning, because if you can pin the certain bad activities on someone or like who their behavior falls into certain categories, then they can be sanctioned. But I also want to highlight another thing, and I think this is where a lot of people have misconceptions. Sanctions do not always involve punishing you. Sometimes there are also positive sanctions in that you're not being punished for doing something, but you're being incentivized. So like you mentioned the GSP plus regime. So so for example, if you are not doing so and so, if you do so and so, we will give you the following incentives. So they are trying to incentivize what they believe to be good behavior. And on this note, I'll also like I'd also like it if you could elaborate the GSP plus scheme a little bit, especially with regards to Pakistan, what it means, and should Pakistan, in your opinion, fulfill all the conditions that are being highlighted in the news these days?
So that's a very good angle of looking at it, because this is exactly why it is important for us to understand these regimes that are in place and will be relevant for our foreign policy. The GSP Plus system basically is a generalized preference system where selected countries will be given better trade terms. And most of these revolve around exemption of taxes, exemption of duties, that would make your goods very, very competitive abroad. And when your goods are cheap abroad, of course, that will increase your exports.
And I'm sorry to cut across. This is only for the EU, right?
This is just for the European Union.
So the EU imposes this scheme.
The EU, this is an EU-based scheme, and it is applicable for all countries of the world. Basically, the European Union, what it wants in lieu of these better trade terms is the fact that you as a country are compliant with major human rights conventions and treaties. Most of these are UN-based conventions and treaties. So it's not just you signing and ratifying them, but actively working to promote their implementation within the country. So in the beginning, that for Pakistan at least revolved around ensuring women's rights, children's rights, labor laws, banning child labor, things of that sort. It also revolved around promoting freedom of speech, ensuring minority rights. For example, those are just an example, but now the European Union sent a delegation recently, I think just a few weeks back. And in the report that was devised afterwards, they recommended that Pakistan sign on to a certain number of extra conventions. And those can be a bit more politically contentious. They include the Rome Statute, which means that Pakistan would agree to be bound by the International Criminal Court, which means that Pakistan can take any country to the ICC for for prosecution of war crimes and genocide, but also that Pakistan
is opening itself up to
to that kind of prosecution as well. So Pakistan can take a case there, or Pakistan can be taken there by any other country. So there are, of course, risks involved with that. And that's where we see the weaponization of the EU's GSP Plus system to get countries to sign on to conventions in lieu of better trade terms. And that's important. Yeah.
No, sorry. And I think from a global south perspective, so we don't have the capacity to partake in the development of international law or in some of these treaties. Yes, we are able to send delegations, but our expertise is not up to par with many of our European counterparts. And when I think of these new sanctions in the context of what you explained with the GSP Plus, don't you think this is some form of cultural hegemony that's being imposed on us? So so without taking any position on something which is very contentious in a lot of Muslim countries, let's say the LGBT issue, right? So I'm not saying whether Pakistan should or should not sign it, but there are things which are accepted in the West which might not be accepted in other parts of the world, especially for a lot of Muslim countries. But when you tie them to such lucrative economic incentives, you're basically asking them to toe your cultural line. But that just leaves us with a very homogenous kind of global culture, which I don't think is an attractive prospect, not to me at least personally.
That's the entire debate behind the new liberal agenda, as a lot of people like to say. The fact that you are not just economically in terms of, so the EU GSP Plus still gives a lot of autonomy in terms of what kinds of products you can export abroad. But when you have something even more, for lack of a better term, something that are more intervention based. So, for example, the IMF review and the IMF's policies or the World Bank's policies or any of these global lending organizations, they rely on certain principles. And I'm not talking about the cultural hegemonic debate in particular, but just neoliberal ideas of how you should run your country, how you should run your economy. And maybe some economies are not suited to that model. but you are being, in lieu of say $2 billion, you're being told these are the austerity measures you should be imposing, this is what you should be doing. And it's like a one size fits all approach that may or may not, and I think probably does not work for a lot of countries.
And also, I think it's important. So, again, without taking any position on what kind of political or economic system works, you have China, which is flourishing economically.
Yeah.
They have a very particular political system. You have Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states,
Yep.
which are monarchies, and they have a very different political system. You have countries in the West like Germany and France. They're doing very well economically,
Right.
very different political system.
Yeah.
So you can't really say like that. Oh, you all have to follow the same system, because all of them are flourishing
That's true.
by developmental standards, that okay, their economy is doing well, their GDP is good, everything is going well. So yeah, you're right. And I think my main issue is with all of this, that it's the poor countries in the global south that suffer, not all and that's basically the problem. And in a way, I think you end up perhaps stifling their growth, because what works, as you said, what works for Germany might not work for Pakistan,
That's
and vice versa.
That's true. Also, it's important to discuss the global South's view on sanctions as well, because we have UN General Assembly resolutions where countries of the South, predominantly African, Latin American countries, and certain Asian countries, which have passed a resolution saying that the application and the broad scale application of unilateral sanctions are disruptive to our economies and create human rights concerns for us. We have examples of Human Rights Council documents, for example, where I believe in an advisory committee for the Human Rights Council, legal experts from around the world gave examples of how the broad scale application of sanctions was not just hindering development, but also infringing on human rights when sanctions were imposed. Yeah. And interestingly, in one document, we found that Pakistan's case, when it came to the Iran gas pipeline, was discussed as a potential human rights infringement case, because you have this one country that is now forced to pay $5 million every single day because it cannot fulfill its contractual obligations within a background of extremely high inflation, extremely high unemployment, power crises, and economic crises. And all this is because of the threat of you being potentially exposed to sanctions, because Iran is being sanctioned. Yeah. And countries are suffering because of that. This kind of leads to another form of sanctions which only the US imposes, which is secondary sanctions or extraterritorial sanctions, which means basically, I think there's no better example than Iran. Whether we want to use Iran as a transit state, or whether we want to engage with Iran, not the sanctioned actors of Iran, but just the non-sanctioned actors of Iran. But just because the word Iran is so contentious, we are scared of attracting sanctions regimes on ourselves. Because the US can say, hey, you are in violation, you're dealing with Iran, and you've been told not to deal with Iran, so therefore we're going to impose some economic costs on you as well. And that's how the isolation scheme is supposedly set in place. The European Union doesn't do that. No other country does that. But this is something that creates an even bigger question of the future of sanctions regimes, and how this could be one way of controlling the world in a place, in a setting where wars have failed for the most part.
And so, that was going to be my final question to you before, as we wrap up. What do you think is going to be the future of sanctions, especially, as I said in the beginning, in this in a multipolar world where China is growing as I don't know if we can call it a great power now, but it's certainly moving towards that point. Russia is very resurgent, and they're completely cashing in on their energy resources in the ongoing crisis. Yeah. And also because both of these countries now, as I mentioned earlier, provide alternate pathways. So if eventually the US does decide to sanction, you're like, okay, fine, I'll align with Russia, I'll align with China. Are we going back to the Cold War era where you will completely alienate yourself from one great power, but that's only because you can align yourself with another great power.
Have an excess of
Yeah.
powers like that. It's very interesting because we've discussed this and I've mentioned this before as well, that the world is in flux, and this whatever is done right now sets a precedent for the future. And this time is very important for scholars and academics to it's important for them to sit and analyze and understand the power dynamics, because what is being established right now will become the accepted practice in the future. And from whatever research I've done, it is increasingly clear that military interventions do not they're not an option that is favorable to the countries that want a military intervention either, because of the economic costs that they carry. Say Afghanistan, where however many billion dollars, US dollars were spent, or trillions of US dollars were spent, and all for what? Or if you go and take other examples, you'll see that countries now want to move away from the military option. What else is left? This non-armed coercive measures in the form of
But
economic.
and I know I said last question for the previous question, but one last question. So
Yeah.
military, you say military is no longer an option. Research says
It's being
it's being reduced.
yeah.
Research says that sanctions do not always work.
Yep.
What is the future pathway? And if you can also include in your answer how Pakistan can navigate this whole global sanctions regime, especially in light of, as you mentioned before, our ongoing energy crisis.
Yeah.
So
So I really like the way how you've succinctly brought this together. Military interventions not the way to go. Sanctions, academically research based, may or may not work. Usually don't work.
Yep.
So where do we go? What is going to be the future? It's still going to be more sanctions.
Okay.
It might not work for some countries, but with new avenues such as horizontalization, thematic sanctions, or when you sanction individuals, or when you sanction targeted sectors, the narrower you go, the more you're able to achieve your objectives. And that means that your sanctions regime was successful.
Right.
That also means that you get to sidestep some of the human rights considerations that can come out of your sanctions regime. Having said that, sanctions design is such a nebulous sort of a field, and again, there's no one size fits all solution here. Sanctions are, whether we like them or not, they're here to stay. And this is where I'm going to plug in the Pakistan part of the question here, that this is how the world is going to be. The world order is going to be based on sanctioning power, carrots and sticks. And it is essential to understand and analyze the laws that legalize sanctions. You have to understand another thing here, which is, again, goes back to the multipolarity part of your question. In the past, we saw that a lot of sanctions were imposed through the UN, so multilateral forms of imposition, which have greater reach, and they're more legitimate as well, and have some form of accountability as well. Now we see countries moving away from multilateral forums and going towards unilateral forums. So the US will have its own sanctions regime, and it may or may not require the UN's approval. That is fine. The US can go and impose its own
US
sanctions.
exceptionalism.
Same
That's how they defend the American exceptionalism to international law and global order.
100%, 100%. But we see the UK doing the same. We see Australia doing the same. We see Japan doing the same. So countries are now in favor of moving towards, their own sanctions regime that would allow them to basically achieve their own foreign policy objectives without them without having everything being vetted by the UN system.
Right.
So now it becomes, where does Pakistan go from here? Coming back to the question, it's increasingly important to understand the laws of sanctions. It's increasingly important for Pakistani stakeholders to go through the text of the US legislation, the US law, and understand what are the exceptions here. It is increasingly important for us to go through major international conventions, especially those to which we're signatory to, World Trade Organization conventions and agreements, to see if there's any leeways or exemptions that can be applied. And economically, because the country is going through a bit of a tough time economically, find sources to sidestep these sanctions, and at the same time on multilateral forums raise their voice against the wholesale application of secondary sanctions, because global south is doing the same. So many
Yeah.
countries in the global south, they have the same narrative, and at the same time come up with avenues and ways where your interests can be protected, but that is to say your economic interests can be protected, but you can still participate as an active member of the global community and participate within the international community. So those are big questions, and they might not be like targeted interventions in that regard, but these are important questions to consider.
You know, we started off with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and how some countries have been making the most of that situation. I recently read a figure that India's current foreign exchange reserves are around $500 billion.
Wow.
And I think I'll borrow something you've said a lot with regards to Pakistan's FATF situation in your other work, that until we become economically self-sufficient and economically strong, we may not like the game, but we still have to play it, and we still have to learn the rules of how to play the game.
100%.
Otherwise, because as you said, the sanctions regime is here to stay, at least for the near future, however long that may be. On that note, we'll conclude our discussion today. Thank you so much, Noor, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. We hope you tune in for future episodes as well.
Thank you.